Ever lay awake at night, heart pounding, because a tiny worry just blew up into a worst-case scenario in your head?
Oh, absolutely. Like forgetting to lock the door and suddenly you're picturing, what, a full-blown home invasion.
Exactly. That's catastrophizing. And today we're going deep, diving into how this can get even more intense when it gets mixed up with certain belief systems, particularly for people on the autism spectrum within the Jehovah's Witness faith.
Right, because it's not just everyday worries getting amplified, it's the added layer of, well, let's say really intense theological concepts.
It's a lot to unpack. So
Hmm.
for anyone unfamiliar with the term, catastrophizing is that tendency to fixate on the worst possible outcome, however unlikely.
And often, these outcomes are completely out of proportion to the actual trigger. The source material we're looking at today breaks it down into three parts: negative forecasting, overgeneralization, and helplessness. Let's imagine someone within the Jehovah's Witness faith. They forget a verse during their Bible study.
Something many of us have experienced regardless of faith.
Right. Now, someone prone to catastrophizing might, because of negative forecasting, immediately jump to the fear of not being saved because of this one mistake.
Wow. So one forgotten verse becomes a sign of impending doom.
Yes. And then overgeneralization kicks in. This one event, this one forgotten verse might make them feel like they're not devout enough, not worthy in the eyes of God.
So even if their life is generally devout, this one event makes them a complete failure.
Exactly. And that's where the helplessness comes in. And the source material emphasizes how this feeling of helplessness can be especially overwhelming for people on the autism spectrum because the world already feels so unpredictable, right? Add in those anxieties that can come from these, well, end times beliefs that are part of the Jehovah's Witness faith, and it's a lot.
Especially for someone who might already experience the world a bit differently, like with the sensory sensitivities that can come with autism.
Exactly. And the source material really gets into how this intersection, the catastrophizing, the end times beliefs, and autism, how it can show up in really specific ways. Heightened anxiety, for one.
So not just worrying about the little things, but like full-blown existential dread.
Right. It's like those everyday worries get dialed up to 11. We're talking, did I turn off the oven? Turning into, if the house burns down, it's a sign of the apocalypse and I'm not going to be saved.
Intense. And the source also talked about isolation and withdrawal. That makes sense, though. If the world feels that overwhelming, wouldn't you want to retreat?
Of course, it's a natural human instinct to control your environment, but, and here's the catch, isolation often just makes those negative feelings stronger. And that takes us to the third point the source really emphasized. The physical, the emotional toll. Just imagine carrying that weight, those anxieties, every single day.
It's exhausting just thinking about it. And the source doesn't sugarcoat it. They talk about insomnia, fatigue, this constant feeling of being on edge.
Yeah, and let's not forget about self-esteem, relationships. It can impact everything. Even just finding joy in the everyday becomes difficult. The source gets real about the struggles, but there's a sense of hope, too. There's a whole section on strategies, resources that can help, which is where I think this deep dive gets really empowering. It's that reminder that even when anxieties are rooted in these really deep beliefs, we don't have to suffer. There are ways to address that suffering.
So where do we even begin? The source material seems to lay out some pretty concrete steps.
It does, and it starts with therapy. But not just any therapy. The source really emphasizes finding someone who gets both autism and religious trauma, which is huge.
Because those beliefs, even though they're deeply personal, they're complicated. Someone who doesn't understand the ins and outs of the Jehovah's Witness faith, they might not get the intensity of those end times anxieties, or worse, they could accidentally invalidate the person's faith while trying to help with the anxiety.
Exactly. It's this balancing act, respecting the belief system, but also giving them tools to deal with the anxiety those beliefs might cause. And speaking of tools, the source talks about cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, as being super effective.
Which, for those of us who aren't therapy nerds, is basically about recognizing and then challenging those thought patterns, like the catastrophizing we've been talking about.
Right. So instead of going down that rabbit hole of the world's ending and it's all my fault, CBT gives you ways to just stop, look at the thought, and try to replace it with something more, realistic.
So in the example of forgetting that Bible verse, how would that actually work using CBT?
Okay, so the thought pops up, God's going to punish me because I messed up and forgot that one verse. A CBT therapist would help them challenge that. They might ask, is there really evidence that forgetting one verse equals punishment? Or, have you always been perfect? Is anyone? Or even, is there another way to see this, like maybe just a human moment of imperfection?
It's about bringing those anxieties back down to earth, right? Grounding them in reality instead of letting them spiral into doomsday scenarios.
Exactly. And the source material goes beyond individual therapy, too. There's this emphasis on community, which we don't talk about that enough, I think.
It makes sense, though, right? When you're dealing with anxieties that are tied to your faith, feeling isolated, like nobody understands, that just makes things worse. It almost confirms the fear.
Totally. The source even specifically mentions support groups, whether it's online or in person, where people can connect with others who truly get it because they've lived it.
There's something so validating about that. To share your experience and realize I'm not alone in this, it can be incredibly healing.
It really, really can. And the source also reminds us that sometimes finding peace within ourselves is just as important as finding that external support. That's where mindfulness practices come in.
This is where things like meditation, deep breathing, that kind of thing can help, right?
Yeah.
Just to quiet the mind, even for a little bit, and step away from those racing, catastrophic thoughts.
You got it. And luckily, there are so many ways to do that these days. The source even suggested guided meditation apps as a starting point, which is great, especially if you're new to meditation.
It's like having a little buddy right there with you, guiding you through it.
Right.
Okay, so we've got therapy, CBT, community support, mindfulness. What was that fifth thing the source mentioned?
Oh, education. It sounds kind of out of place, but the source made this point about how knowledge, especially about high control groups, their tactics, it can really help combat fear.
So learning about how certain groups might use things like fear or guilt to control people, that could help someone in this situation reclaim their own power, their own agency.
Yes, and it's not about ditching their faith altogether. It's about giving them the tools to look at it all with a critical eye, to figure out what's truly their own belief versus something that's been, I don't know, maybe imposed on them.
Like getting that bigger picture perspective, which can be really powerful.
Wow, we really dug deep today. I think the takeaway, though, from this source material, and hopefully what we've emphasized here, is that even when you're facing fear, uncertainty, especially about something as big as your faith, there's always hope. There's always a path towards healing.
Absolutely. And no matter how alone you might feel on those anxieties, there are resources, there are strategies, there are communities out there ready to help you on that journey.
And on that note, I'll leave you with this. We focused on catastrophizing, end times beliefs, autism within the Jehovah's Witness faith. But it makes you wonder what other beliefs, ideologies, even just everyday anxieties could be amplified by this tendency to catastrophize. Something to think about as you continue your own deep dive into, well, being human. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and remember, those worst case scenarios, usually they're just our imaginations running wild.